This is Christopher from the Manly Movie Review, and today I'm talking with Scott Matscherz and Josh Erlien about the 2014 movie Exodus, Gods and Kings.
I'm Scott Matscherz. I'm the leader of a nonprofit organization called I Hope International, and we use that to teach overseas and help the poor, help orphans, help widows, create fresh water wells for those who live in villages that don't have access to fresh water. So we like to do a lot of things to help around the world.
Now, Scott, have you actually been to either Egypt or Israel?
Yes, I've been to both. One of the things that we do as an educational aspect of our nonprofit is to lead trips to the Holy Land. So we go to Israel. We have a trip coming up in February going to Israel, and then some of us are going to go to Jordan and see Petra and some of the archaeological sites in Jordan afterwards. And I've also been to Egypt 3 times.
My name is Joshua Erlien. I'm with thecruxofthematter.org, where we deal with theology, apologetics, and pop culture. And I'm happy to be here.
Is it just a known fact that all this happened in the 19th dynasty of Egypt, and that it definitely must have happened during the reign of Ramesses II?
No, there's lots of debate on that. There's lots of different opinions. So it's it can be an important thing to debate and study, but each viewpoint has books and scholars that support it. So it's it's quite a large issue, and I haven't come to a conclusion on which one's correct. If the people that think they're right, they may be right, but they still haven't been able to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. So I think everything's still up for interpretation on the exact timing of the events and who was the pharaoh of the Exodus.
Pretty early on in the movie, they mention the looming threat of the Hittite Empire. Leading scholars of archaeology in the 19th century tended to believe that the Hittites were just totally legendary, just some mythical people that the Bible made up. And here it is in a movie. It's like, I don't know, this is my first time to see Hittites in a movie. In the movie, they plunge you right into an exciting battle scene. Thousands of chariots and foot troops fighting with each other, Egyptians versus Hittites. That this may have been inspired from a real and actual battle, the Battle of Kadesh. Some people say it's the largest chariot battle ever fought, perhaps involving 5,000 or 6,000 chariots. Thought to end in a draw. Are the Hittites a legendary people?
No, there is evidence now that they existed. You have to remember that the Bible is historically reliable, and it is evidence that these people existed, even if there was not outside confirmation of that fact. So then when you add the confirmation from other sources outside of the Scripture, that increases the biblical reliability, and it also shows you that these events and people actually lived and the things took place as they are mentioned in Scripture.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that Scott brings up is that we don't get to the reliability of the Bible by each shovelful, like, oh, I hope it's still true. I hope it's still true. We've established once we've established that, it's going to seem like a bit of a sidestep here, but once we establish that Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus says that the Bible is the Word of God, and there we have it on good authority that the Bible is going to be without error. And so we're not coming at it wondering, each time we look at an archaeological find or something like that, we're not wondering, is the Bible true? These things can work to confirm and to encourage, but we have it on very good authority. The God who cannot lie says, yeah, the Bible is true. It's my word.
At some point, Moses visits the city of the slaves, ends up talking with one of the elders. And Moses visits the city of the slaves, ends up talking with one of the elders, and then as he leaves, he ends up killing 2 Egyptians who have mistaken him for a slave. Does that match up with the Bible?
Not that I recall. That is a veering from the biblical story. I mean, Moses does kill a guard, but it's in defense of a Hebrew slave, but it's not because of a misunderstanding of his identity.
Yeah, so I think that was just the artistic license taking over there and making it more of a Hollywood kind of scene than what actually took place.
Sure. Which I think is why they did the battle, the battle scene early on. I mean, they've got to get Christian Bale out on the battlefield and try to out Gladiator Russell Crowe and do something epic.
And I think another reason they did that was to show the two brothers sort of being united, but also in conflict. So it was clear from the battle scene that Moses was the better military leader than Ramses. And then I think Ramses started taking that personally and being, he felt at odds more with Moses because he knew Moses was superior. So then I think that's part of the whole plot of the movie. I think Ridley Scott tried to make this mainly a story about these two brothers and how they, reacted to one another and how they went through life together. And at the end of the movie, Ridley Scott, dedicates the movie to his brother who had died. So I think, he was thinking some of those kind of things throughout the movie and trying to make it become a real life, story of two brothers instead of just, a historical narrative.
Now, in the movie, they portray Moses as being exiled by Pharaoh. Now, in the actual Exodus account, he actually flees. He realizes he's in danger, that Pharaoh wants him dead, so he flees and lands in Midian. That brings us to one of the next scenes. You have Moses defending some of Jethro's daughters and ends up getting married to one of them.
Yeah, I thought they did a great job with that scene where Moses comes to the rescue. To Zipporah. He drives off the other shepherds, and that kind of creates his inroad there with Jethro. And I was pleased with how they portrayed Jethro and that connection that Moses makes with Zipporah and things like that.
Jethro, he is actually described in Exodus as a priest there in Midian. So I wonder what you guys think about this primitive monotheism theory. When Moses would go to Pharaoh, for instance, and talk about God, in the movie, Pharaoh says, "Which God?" But in Exodus, I don't really get that. I think people have a sense, including Jethro and even Pharaoh, and while Pharaoh worships many gods and even considers himself a god, it's still meaningful for Moses to approach him and say, "Hey, God says, let my people go." What do you guys think of that?
Well, I personally think that monotheism was the original religion, and then other things developed after that. And in fact, a friend of ours, Dr. Winford Corbin, wrote a book on it. It's great to get on the subject. It's called In the Beginning God, A Fresh Look at the Case for Original Monotheism. He makes the case that the original religion was monotheism, and then it developed into polytheism and all these other different variations. So I think that probably has some of the answers that you're looking for.
Next question is that of theophanies, of God materializing in some way in our space-time continuum, God localizing in some way. I mean, when we talk of God, of course, we're talking of an infinite being, and yet there can still be manifestations of God, where he maybe reaches down into our world and makes himself visible in some way. So, what does God look like is ultimately the question I'm getting at. And just as a reminder, in the movie, you have Moses walking up this forbidden mountain, and I believe a rock slide comes down upon him, large rock hits him on the head, he wakes up kind of buried in a slurry or a wadi, and sees the burning bush, and then God appears to him. What are your thoughts on this? What does God look like when he appears?
When he appears in real life or when he appears in the movie?
Both, either.
Yeah.
Take your pick.
Yeah. Well, Jesus said something striking on this subject. He said, "No one has seen God at any time." Well, we take it to mean that because God is spirit, and spirit isn't the type of thing that you see, and the being of God is so much other than what we are, that we can't apprehend him, or we can't comprehend him in his being, through sight or other means like that. We can apprehend him with our minds, but can't wrap our minds around him. But there were times when God says things like, he speaks to Moses face to face, as a man speaks with his friend. And then there was an appearance to Joshua. So it does seem that God does appear, make physical manifestations. But Ridley Scott, or the writers decided to cast the visage of God as an 11-year-old boy, which was really interesting, and I think pregnant with meaning.
I'm not sure why they did it that way either, other than they probably wanted to do something that no one else has done that way, so then at least it would stand out, whether it was accurate or not. I don't think that was their concern.
Right.
I can speak to that. In one interview, Ridley Scott said, and this is a quote, he said, "Sacred texts give no specific depiction of God, so for centuries artists and filmmakers have had to choose their own visual description. Moloch, who is the name of the 11-year-old boy, Moloch exudes innocence and purity, and those two qualities are extremely powerful."
Now, and there was a scene where Moses, a little bit later, after he's had a few encounters with Moloch, Moses says he's tired of dealing. It sounded to me like he said, "I'm tired of dealing with messengers." Now, he could have said, "I'm tired of being the messenger." I could have swore he said, "I'm tired of dealing with messengers." And I'm thinking, who's the messenger here? Is it the kid? Well, one commentator wrote that that God is portrayed as this petulant, willful child, and in a lot of ways, that's kind of the impression that you get, that this kid is, he's finite in the sense that he's a child, and yet he's immortal in the sense that he never grows old. Even at the end of the movie, when you see him again, and Moses is a very old man, but the child is still the identical age, still the same choppy haircut. But it struck me as being almost a nod to some type of a Gnostic view of God, where the creator of our world is this lesser deity that is strong enough to create material beings, but and also foolish enough to do it. That there's something intrinsically bad about creating beings like us that are entrapped in bodies and things like that. And it all gets to sound a little bit Platonic in some regards, but where he's this finite God who thinks he's the only God out there, but he's really not. He's weak and maybe petulant and things like that, which I thought fit very well with portraying God as an 11-year-old boy who has this sense of, it's not right for Israel to be in captivity for 400 years and to be treated so badly, and we're going to get them. And even when Moses starts to plead for Pharaoh in Egypt, Moloch is like, no, he's not broken yet, kind of a thing. Not till he doesn't have an army anymore, then we know we've got him. And and then the final plague, even Moses actually is totally against it,
right?
And says so.
Yep.
Which gives a very, well, to say the least, problematic view of the divine being, as being maybe impetuous, or flying into a passion, and just vindictive, even, which is very popular today, I think. We all like to
Right.
think of, or not me personally, but in general, our society likes to think of God that way.
In the movie, the child God that Moses is arguing with, the child God says, "I just want to see them on their knees begging," and then Moses, he didn't want anything to do with it, and he said, "No, you can't do this. I want no part of this." So, he's standing there arguing with God, which is that's obviously not in the text of Scripture. Because he's basically shouting back at God. It's not like he's trying to discuss it. And then the boy God he seems to be a little bit out of control at this point, like just trying to get some kind of revenge. And even Moses brings that up, and saying anything more than that is just revenge. It's not just. It's somehow the child God is being unjust in what he's doing.
Yeah.
And the way the child actor is portraying it, it seems like he is being unjust and out of control.
Yep.
Throughout the movie, when the boy god shows up, it almost seems like it's Moses's dirty little secret in a way. Like you're left wondering, is it just a hallucination? Because it starts after he gets hit on the head with a large rock. Immediately, Zipporah says as much, and Zipporah is the believer in the one God, and Zipporah says, hey, you're just seeing things. You got hit on the head with a rock. Nobody is able to see this boy God except for Moses, and then Aaron sees Moses talking to the boy God here and there, but the boy God's invisible to Aaron. There's no indication anywhere else that any other person can actually see this God, and there's even no indication again in the movie that anyone even knows, except for Aaron, who knows Moses' dirty little secret. Nobody even knows that Moses has supposedly spoken with God about it.
And it was also very interesting too when they're, in the midst of their flee from Egypt, which fascinating twist in the story. Moses gets lost. He's got what they say, 400,000 people in the desert, and he doesn't know where he's going. And and then I think it's Joshua at one point says, "Well, what does God say?" They're at the fork in the road kind of a thing, and do we go over the mountains? Do we take the pass? What do we do? And Moses doesn't know what to do, and so we're going to go over the mountains. And they say, "What does God say?" We're going over the mountains. So it's very, very much an uncertainty, which plays in very well, I think, with this weaker, childlike God picture that's been drawn already. That God isn't the Almighty, that's filled with wisdom and has planned this from the beginning. That He knows exactly the route that He's taking them, and He's really speaking to Moses like a man speaks to his friend. Moses is actually hearing His voice. And in fact, at one point, the whole congregation hears the voice of God. And they say, "No, we don't want to hear God's voice anymore. That was a bit much for us. We'll just let Moses hear it." So it's definitely a consistent picture of God through that, through the Exodus process, seems to me.
And one thing that seems pretty consistent throughout the Old and New Testament, like all books of the Bible, is when God does manifest Himself in some localized fashion, there does tend to be something something along the idea of fire and or smoke and or lightning, something very glorious, such that later when Shaul is on the road to Damascus and he's encompassed by a brilliant light, he knows that's the Shekinah glory of God, and says, "Who are you, Lord?" So that's a consistent. I think I would have preferred to have seen that in a movie. If you're going to try to represent God manifesting Himself in some limited way, it needs to be something very fiery, something bright, something glorious, and of course, really, Exodus 33, God does that on the mountain of God. It's all sorts of frightening sense of smoke and lightning and thunder, and it's a scary thing. And like you said, Josh, the people are scared of that, and they're like, yeah, we're not going up there. You go talk to him. So I think that would have been a more consistent way to say, all right, what does God look like? All right, well, let's look at Exodus 33, and where Moses says, hey, show me your glory. He's saying that to God. God says, well, I'm going to let all of my goodness pass in front of you, but I'm not going to let you see my face. No man can see my face and live. I will cause my glory to pass by you. And even then, God limits the amount of glory that Moses is allowed to see.
Right. I think he would have done better to stick with the biblical, the way the Bible describes, God's manifestation. It's in the burning bush. God speaks to him through the burning bush. You don't see in the narrative that God sees any person at that point or any body. He hears God's voice, and without the hit on the head, which is an interesting thing. It seemed like they were. I don't want to take that rabbit trail just yet, but what I wish that they had brought out was that it wasn't ambiguous for the children of Israel that God was leading them, because there was a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day that led the way for them as they traveled through the wilderness. And what's important, I think, to remember is that God was laying a foundation for the children of Israel. And so he had to make it big. He had to make it strong. That, yes, I really am here. Yes, I really do see you. And yes, you really can trust me. I'm gonna take down the competition. I'm going to show that I'm God over all. I'm going to show that I'm strong enough to take you out of the land of Egypt. In fact, God often refers back to this when he wants to say something to Israel. He says, I'm the God that brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, things like that. But this created an anchor for them historically, and a way for God to say, you need to trust me, and here's why you need to trust me. And so now, since he set himself a reliability standard, now he can call them to account for whether they trust him or not. And that's totally lacking in the movie.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest weaknesses in the movie is you never know for sure if God actually exists. It's all left up to your personal interpretation or your imagination. It could be just a hallucination after you got hit on the head by rocks. So it's never a clear battle between God and the Pharaoh of Egypt. It's just sort of speculation, and it's almost like the Pharaoh has more belief in Moses as God than Moses does. Moses, he's not even sure if God exists, and if he does, he's arguing with him. And part of the biggest things of the movie is Moses is battling with God just as much as he's battling with Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like God is on our side and I'm his spokesperson and I'm going to come and tell you what God's saying. It's like everything's just up in the air. There's no absolute message from God. So in the movie, Moses is not really being God's spokesman, because he never tells you what God is saying. He doesn't explain these conversations to Pharaoh. In the scripture, it tells you very clearly, God will tell Moses what to say, what sign to do to show that he's a messenger of God. But Moses in the movie never goes and does that. So you never know that a God exists, because none of the miraculous events occurs to prove that there's a God and that Moses is the messenger from God. Mm-hmm. So I think that's to the detriment of the movie.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. So that's a foundational shift from the from the biblical story. I mean, now we're telling a different story. And what was interesting, Scott, you brought up something that reminded me of the. Did you guys see the science guy character in the movie?
Oh yeah, he was
shows
great.
up. He's like some kind of advisor or something like that, and he's explaining how, well, the Nile turns to blood because of the, the crocodiles and their feeding frenzy. They stirred up all this silt, and there was all this blood and silt and everything, which killed all the fish. And that brought out all the frogs, and then the frogs die, and that brings the flies, and then the flies bring the boils, and and things like that. Well, so he shows up, and it sure sounded like, oh, this is Bill Nye. It's he's like explaining everything from the from a modern naturalistic perspective, that this is how things work. It's a mechanistic universe, which seemed anachronistic to me. But I was trying to figure out exactly where they were going with the story. Are they just doing the straight up anti-supernatural thing, or are they doing some kind of a Gnostic, mystical, alien thing? And it seemed like they were kind of making a nod in a few directions, and I wasn't sure, if they landed on a particular planet or not. On the one hand, there was nothing that was truly a miracle per se. Everything could have been explained through naturalistic, though improbable, yet naturalistic explanations. The feeding frenzy of the crocodiles, all the things that the science guy explained, and then even the parting. It wasn't really even a parting; it was more of a receding of the Red Sea with that huge tsunami. I wasn't sure where they were going, and it wasn't the biblical story. That's where they're not going.
Yeah, I think part of the reason he did that was he sort of took a middle road approach, so that way all the scientific people watching the movie can say, "Oh, see, it has all these scientific explanations," and then the religious people can still say, "Okay, we see what happened, the events that happened, but we know the cause behind it was actually God doing these miracles, even though that's not made clear in the movie that they're actually miracles. They're just, it's like a chain of events that happens with the plagues." And I think some of the plagues are in the movie are in a different order from the Bible. There aren't any crocodiles, causing the plagues in the Bible. So some of that was just Hollywood, and you could never kill enough people by crocodiles to make the Nile River red. So the original premise for how the chain of events starts, is faulty, and then it just goes from there. It's just one faulty premise tied to another faulty premise, and so there aren't any real miracles shown in the movie, like Josh said. And then I was thinking about it when I saw the movie. I was thinking, hey, there aren't any miracles here, no true miracles that you know for sure, except for the miracle at the end when Ramses is not killed by the tsunami.
Yeah.
So because when you see the movie and you see how big the wave is and all the other circumstances going on, there's no way he could have ever survived.
Right.
So that was more miraculous than the actual things that were miracles in the Bible.
Well, there was one miracle that didn't have at least a readily ascertainable natural explanation, and that was the final one with the Passover and the death of the firstborn. You don't get a clear picture of what's actually causing this. That seemed a little bit. I mean, that one didn't have a naturalistic explanation apparent. Now, and I mentioned this when we were talking before the show. Maybe it's just my imagination, but it sure felt like it was a giant spacecraft flying over the city. This huge shadow. It's like, is that a shadow of a spacecraft? It kind of sounds like a spacecraft. What is this? And maybe I just had my head full of Ridley Scott alien movies and Prometheus and things like that. But I don't know. He didn't give an explanation except that it was Moloch said he was going to do it. But that one plague did seem to defy explanation on the naturalistic perspective.
Yeah, that's true. Because they have no reason that the firstborn son would die. You know, there might be an explanation why some sons would die, but you could never pick out only the firstborn, and none of the Hebrew firstborn children died.
Right. And it wasn't very clear on the sacrificial lamb, you know. And I mean, obviously, I'm saying this tongue in cheek, but obviously they have to downplay this part because, you know, that would actually smack of the gospel if they understood that there's a destroying angel that's coming, but if you can take the blood of this lamb and have your household covered under the blood, then the destroying angel is going to pass over you. And this whole picture just sure looks a lot like Jesus, as being our Passover lamb and our shield from judgment. But in the movie, you never get a clear picture if this boy God told Moses to do this, or if Moses just had this idea. I think I can turn his anger away or his destruction away, or at least it wasn't clear to me. Where this very central. This is going to be central to the whole culture of Israel, from thereafter is the Passover, and it's just not clear, at least to me, where the source is. Is it Moses, or is it Molech, or is it something else? I don't know.
Yeah, I think part of the fundamental problems with the movie is, other than using biblical characters, some biblical events. The Bible's not really in this movie. It's it's just a framework that they can hang a movie on, made by Hollywood.
Yeah.
So they're not trying to be accurate to the text, which we understand. Hollywood is like that. So we understand how they disregard truth and reality. They often just want to make a blockbuster movie to make a lot of money, which that's understandable too. But yeah. I think the biblical story is a whole lot better than any Ridley Scott story. So he would have been wiser to tap into more of the biblical plot, and I think it would have made it a richer film. It would have definitely been more accurate.
Right.
It's hard to improve on the plot elements of the Bible. And Ridley Scott, he didn't have, or not that I know of, any true biblical scholars take a look at this and give him feedback. But he did have some rabbis look at it, and one of the rabbis that was the consulting rabbi, David Barron of Beverly Hills Temple of the Arts. He looked at it and he gave him input, and I guess Ridley Scott took some of the input. But it wasn't like they were trying to make it even, according to the Jewish tradition, because they were adding a lot of, concepts that were just interpretations by different rabbis over the centuries, different midrash. So, for instance, some group of Sephardic scholars apparently thought that one of the plagues were actually crocodiles. So he wasn't, I guess, just completely making that up out of thin air. He was playing to a tradition of some of the rabbis that they actually held to.
Yeah, there does seem to be like a spectrum of naturalistic explanations, also kind of a middle way called hyper-naturalistic explanations, and then you've got pure supernaturalistic explanations. Yeah, the guy the guy you refer to as the science guy, I always think of him as the Surgeon General, and I really liked the way there's a little bit of comic relief on the way when he's explaining the natural succession of the different plagues, and he says, well, there's so many things that modern medical science doesn't quite understand yet, but we think things like anthrax could possibly go from the livestock to humans, just using even very small animals, and Ramses just looks at him and says, like, flies? And the next thing you see is he's being hung. The Surgeon General is being hung from the gallows.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's my Bill Nye character. He's just seemed totally modern.
Yeah, that's one of the things that there really was missing from the movie was in the real story, God did protect against that. And take for instance the first plague of turning the Nile into blood. It's very clear that Moses and Aaron, but mainly Moses, was told, "Hey, take the staff, the rod of God, the staff of God. Take your staff, this humble instrument of a shepherd. Take that, and in full sight of Pharaoh and his servants, raise it over the Nile River, and it will turn to blood." And he says, go over to other bodies of water, freshwater lakes, canals, and raise the staff above those. Those will become blood as well. And then even to the point where even water that is like in standing jars would turn to blood. And so that of course defies some of the naturalistic or even the hyper-naturalistic explanations of, like red algae just oversaturating the water, sucking out all the oxygen, and the fish dying. Doesn't really explain how that would happen to jars of water elsewhere.
Right. Well, and this idea of the hypernatural explanations, you don't find these coming just from skeptics. You find these actually coming from Christian apologists and different ones trying to defend the Bible, and which just seems so strange, to say the least. It's for one thing, it seems a little bit inconsistent to believe that God requires some kind of a naturalistic explanation for miracles. If he creates the universe, certainly he should be strong enough to disrupt it now and then, or suspend the laws that he's created, or have a greater law that's able to overcome it, or something. It's like C.S. Lewis said, that once you let a divine foot in the door, there's no safety against miracles. So if there is a God, miracles are entirely possible, and they don't need to have a super coincidental explanation from nature to do that. It just seems ad hoc, and it seems, frankly, unreasonable.
Yeah, it fits in well with what Scott said earlier about maybe the writers and the director were just playing it safe, And mediocre miracles, to me, kind of suggest a mediocre God. So this kind of fits into a finite God hypothesis, or even some polytheistic explanation, and that brings me back to some of Ridley Scott's choices. My understanding is Ridley Scott is either an agnostic or an atheist at heart. And he actually said ahead of time in some interview, he said that, hey, I'm going to look for more naturalistic sounding ways to explain the plagues, make them a little more believable. But also, you brought up Prometheus, Josh, and my understanding is Prometheus installment number 1 came out a few years ago. Number 2 is going to come out somewhere in the not too distant future. And something interesting came out of that saga. It seems that even though Ridley Scott doesn't believe in gods per se, either in the polytheistic or even the true monotheistic sense where you have an infinite God, even though he doesn't believe in gods, he does seem very interested in the possibility of aliens. And that's kind of understandable in some sense, because when you really get to think about the origin of life on planet Earth, there's just no way that naturalistic evolution can produce it. So, especially if you only have, even if you go by like 4.5 million years age, there's just no way that by chance and arrangement of different amino acids can produce life. So that's why I think a lot of people are coming to their senses and saying, yeah, that can't produce life. That doesn't explain the origin of life. So they try to push it back one level and say, well, yeah, so there was some other life from some other galaxy that came to our universe and seeded life into ours. And so Ridley does seem very favorable towards that. And as I understand it, he's got this class of beings that he refers to as the engineers, beings that maybe seed and or superintend human civilization and technology and religion and medicine and things like that. And every once in a while, these engineers will send one of their own to Earth to try to improve things. So the idea of in fact, Ridley actually said one of the engineers was sent back to Earth in the during the Roman Empire, and what happened to him? Things were getting out of hand with the Roman Empire. This engineer was sent to fix things, and we ended up crucifying him. So clearly that's a reference to Jesus as an engineer, as an alien, as definitely something less than a god, but something more than a human. So I wonder if the finite boy god might possibly be of that same ilk.
Yeah, I mean it's got curbside appeal for me, because then that would give some warrant to my spaceship hypothesis for the final plague too.
Yeah, I think I see that in some of the recent Marvel movies as well. Where the gods of Asgard, Loki, Thor, Odin, etc. They're on one hand they're presented as gods, but then there's an undercurrent of saying, well, no, they're really just aliens, and of course humans just interpret that as gods because they're more powerful than people. And then of course there's also a parallel stream of saying, really there's no difference between magic and technology. Magic is just technology that you don't understand.
Actually that comes up in the Thor movie. He actually says that to Jane, and makes this correlation between magic and science.
Your ancestors called it magic, and you call it science. Well, I come from a place where they're one and the same thing.
To Jane, and makes this correlation between magic and science, and which is also very popular today. The new scientism. It's a good film on this. It was done by the Discovery Institute. It's short, actually. I think it's 2 short films. It's called The Magician's Twin, and they talk about this scientism, this rise of scientism, and how that has become the new religion, and scientists are the high priests, and the only knowledge that can be attained is through the scientific method, and some of these other commitments to that. But it seems very much like magical thinking.
These are images of archaeological digs from all over the earth. These are ancient civilizations that were separated by centuries. They shared no contact with one another, and yet the same pictogram showing men worshipping giant beings pointing to the stars was discovered at every last one of them.
So you're saying we're here because of a map you 2 kids found in a cave, is that right?
No, not a map. An invitation.
From whom?
We call them engineers.
Kuiva on itam sa stater kreda.
Uarnon idemariukat karkarste.
What did he say? What did he say? I told him he wanted to live forever.
Hey, Chris, when you mentioned Ridley Scott's belief that these engineers are the ones trying to control things, I guess, on Earth and have brought life here, it doesn't really answer the question though of where first life came from, does it? So they still have to have an answer. It just pushes it back one level, but they're still not telling you, well, where these aliens come from. So it doesn't get them any further in their case, does it actually?
I agree with you totally. I mean, your choice there is either you have an infinite regress of, well, this race created that race, this species created that species, and keep going ad infinitum, or that I think you probably hit the nail on the head. Probably the thing that attracts them to that is they just want to give their precious theory of naturalistic evolution more time, because if you just give it more time, anything's possible. And it's just, I think the scientific community just is starting to really understand that life as we know it, carbon-based life forms, are just way too amazing. Even single-celled organisms are not simple life, and there's just no way for that to even happen in 4.5 billion years, as they would say, of Earth history. So yeah, if you can push it to another galaxy, then maybe that adds a few billion years to your equation, and more reason for optimism there. Really, you should at that point run into other problems like irreducible complexity and specified complexity, and just say no, this just can't happen. You really can't say, oh, give it an infinite amount of time in an infinitely old universe, and eventually you'll get it right, and you'll have first life spring up on some planet somewhere if it just has some water on it, because frankly, just having water on it is not going to. I think the catalog of necessary conditions on a planet for life to even exist, carbon-based life to exist, that list is growing, pretty much every day. And right now there's no less than like 200 very specific things that have to be perfectly fine-tuned before life can even be put on a planet. So I'm with you. There's no chance for that working, but that the pushing it back one level gives you that layer of obfuscation, and I think it lets you fool more people, and lets people even fool themselves a little better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's like a science of the gaps. We don't have an explanation, but science will figure it out.
Josh, you brought up the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night, and that was definitely something that was missing from the movie. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I have a vague memory of the pillar, which is of course a localization, a manifestation of God's presence. This pillar actually separated Pharaoh's army from the what might have been 2.5 million Israelites as they were approaching the Red Sea. And so that's definitely something that was missing. Ridley, or the writers, put in this idea of, here's Pharaoh taking his chariots over a narrow mountain pass, and it collapses, and that was. Don't know where he pulled that out of, but back to this idea of a pillar of fire by day and by night, and cloud by day. This kind of, if that were included into the equation, then there's no sense of Moses talking to quote unquote God is the dirty little secret that only Aaron knows. It's like, no, every Hebrew knows that Moses has been talking to God, and and then this is also I kind of like to think of it as like the finger of God, like God's reaching his finger down from his heavenly dimensions into our space-time continuum. It's not really his finger, but just easier for me to think of it that way. And he provides protection for the Hebrews that way. And this is the same. So, Scott, I've never been to the Sinai Peninsula. I've never been to the Arabian Peninsula, but I hear things like it can be very inhospitable there. Like, something like areas have like a 1/4 inch of rain per year. Daytime temperatures in Fahrenheit can get up to like 135, maybe even 140 degrees. And at night, even on the same night, it might drop down to like 40 degrees or maybe even colder. Are there actually places like that?
Yeah, it's pretty inhospitable, especially at certain times of the year. So when we lead our tours to Israel, we tend to go earlier in the year. Like I said, we're going to go in February because the temperatures are just right. There's less crowds. You don't necessarily want to go to some of those sites during the summer because it's way too hot, especially if you're going to the desert areas like the Sinai Peninsula. One time when I was in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates in Dubai, it was during the summer, and it was 130 degrees in the shade. And it was so intense. I mean, you could hardly just stand out in the shade, and everything there is air conditioned. They even have some of their beaches air conditioned. So it's extremely intense heat. So I can imagine being in some of these other places where, when you don't even have the modern conveniences, how difficult it would be.
So what do you think of this theory? I forget who I heard this from, but somebody suggested to me that maybe this pillar wasn't just like a little column. Maybe it was more than that. Maybe it was something where, during the daytime, as a pillar of cloud, you've got 2.5 million Hebrews who can actually take shelter under the shade that this cloud provides. And then at night, when temperatures get very cold, that maybe this pillar of fire could even produce some warmth. I know I'm sorry to put you on the spot here. I know it's impossible to say one way or the other, but what do you think about that idea? If let's say if you were a filmmaker, might you direct a film like that?
Yeah, I think that would be, that's a more logical possibility than some of the other things that Ridley Scott decided to include in this movie. So, and the only thing that I saw in the movie resembling any pillar of anything was the water spouts in the sea towards the end of the movie when the tsunami and the big storm was approaching. So maybe he thought that was some kind of pillar of cloud, having a water spout in the sea. Yeah, and about the tsunami waves, we mentioned before that, in the movie, the water just, the level starts going down, and then it sort of turns into what looks like a river with the current going one way, and then eventually the rocks started being exposed, and then the Israelites start walking through the water, and then it gets drier and drier as they go. But, the biblical text says that they walked across on dry land. It says that the water was as walls on each side, so it was more like the Cecil B. DeMille version, not the Ridley Scott version.
Right.
Because, the Cecil B. DeMille version had to be miraculous. The Ridley Scott version could be anything. It could be a tsunami. It could just be high winds blowing the water off. It could be all kinds of, scientific, supposedly, explanations. So I think, that's probably one of the reasons he did it that way and didn't portray the biblical text correctly. Because if you made the visual images the same as the biblical text, then the only explanation can be the miraculous hand of God. It can't be anything else.
So let's talk a minute about miracles. So now, by miracles, we don't really mean just something that's unusual, right?
Well,
yes,
I think
that
it depends on, well, it depends on who you're talking to. I think that Dr. Norman Geisler has done a great service in clarifying for a lot of people that, okay, when we talk about miracles, we really have to have a pretty narrow field. We're talking about acts of God. And so if there are things that have naturalistic explanations, they're not necessarily, acts of God. And part of the reason for that is that miracles don't happen in a vacuum. They're not for their own sake. Miracles have a very distinct purpose. It seems clear that God is doing, at least two things with miracles. There's the immediate surface level mercy on somebody, like if it's a healing or something like that. Jesus heals the blind man. That's a mercy to the blind man, and that's an important aspect of it. But I think there's something deeper. It's this communication aspect where God is using this to communicate something, and to say that, okay, this is something that only God can do. Therefore, that this message or this messenger is sent by God, because God's put his stamp on it. And if you have ambiguous miracles, or if you have just normals, like, okay, babies are born all the time. it's a beautiful, wonderful thing, and ultimately it's a miracle in the sense the whole universe is a miracle, but not in the strict sense that we're talking about. Those things that really can only be attributed to God, and that's the kind of clarity that that is helpful, and that we can thank Dr. Geisler for that.
And that makes sense, because like if I came to you guys and I said, "Hey, my name is Christopher, and I just want to let you know I'm God's spokesman. He's given me an important message to tell you." What are you going to think at that point? You've got at least a couple choices to to think about what kind of judgment to make about me at that point.
Yeah, well, I would ask, how do we know that what you're saying is true?
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
That would be very, very reasonable, and that's
then
what
I would ask, for some kind of proof. Prove what you're saying is true and that you're a spokesman for God.
Yeah,
which is the very thing that I ask the Jehovah's Witnesses when they come to my door. They claim. Well, the first thing I ask them is, do I need your organization to come to a knowledge that leads to eternal life, or can I find that just on my own study of the scriptures? Well, after they hum and haw a while, yeah, you need the organization, they say. Okay, and then I said, well, I need to know why I should trust the organization. And I asked them to give me positive evidence, and then I give them negative evidence of failed predictions. And say, if I can't trust you on the things that I can test, how can I trust you on those things that I can't test? If I can test your predictions about the end of the world and the coming of Christ, and see that you failed there, how can I trust you on the things that you say about heaven and salvation and forgiveness and peace with God, those things that I can't see tangibly right now anyway?
Yeah, that's a good point, Josh. And when I talk to my Mormon friends, one of the things that the Mormons always ask you to do is to pray to see if the Book of Mormon is true. And if you have a burning experience, like they call it a burning in the bosom, if you have that experience, they take that to mean that the Book of Mormon is true. But I ask them, there's no content to a physical sensation. So if you have a burning in the bosom, which undoubtedly many of them actually have a physical sensation, I'm saying that there's no content to that. There's no message with that content. So how do you know that feeling is telling you that the Book of Mormon is false and that you shouldn't become a Mormon? And they don't have any answer for that because it's just a subjective interpretation of an event. But in the Bible, a miracle is a divine intervention in the natural world that produces an event that would not have resulted from purely natural causes. So in the Bible, miracles are always connected to a truth claim. They're there to confirm a message of God through a messenger of God. And when you take those elements out, then it's not really a miracle anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I can give you a quote from Exodus 7 that dovetails in perfectly with what you're saying there. All right. Yeah, Exodus 7, verse 7, Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When Pharaoh says to you, 'Perform a miracle,' then say to Aaron, 'Take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a serpent.'" So this was actually anticipated. Pharaoh was not a totally unreasonable guy. He says, "All right, I hear you. You're claiming to speak for God. You're making demands." Oh, and by the way, the demand that was made by Moses was actually not, "Hey, Pharaoh, let all your people go so that we can ruin the Egyptian economy because you don't have any slaves." The actual demand was just simply, "Hey, let us go into the wilderness for 3 days so that we can make sacrifices, and worship to our God." So they really weren't even asking. Here's a pet peeve of mine about this movie. In pretty much what feels like almost every scene or every other scene, Moses is holding a sword or maybe a bow and arrow, at one point even a war club. But he's when the boy God approaches him and says, "Hey, I need a general," he's talking about, I need you to be a leader of war. I need you to lead the Hebrews in guerrilla warfare. And not once in the entire movie does, if I'm correct, does Moses ever pick up a staff, a shepherd's staff for shepherding sheep. He always has swords. In fact, when he goes back from Midian to Egypt, he's just loaded for bear. He's got bows, arrows, huge battle sword, and then of course his royal sword as well. And from the Exodus account, I don't believe there's any evidence that you can point to that says Moses ever picked up a sword. This is something that Christian Bale said that ruffled quite a few feathers talking about Moses. He says, "I think the man was likely schizophrenic and was one of the most barbaric individuals that I have ever read about in my life. He is a very troubled and tumultuous man who fought greatly against God and against his calling." And so, I think the more I think about that, the more I think, well, yeah, I actually know what he's talking about. He's talking about the Moses of the movie Exodus more than the actual book of Exodus. In the Torah, Moses is referred to as being very meek, which I understand is you're powerful, but you've got your power under control. You're not out of control. You're not. There were scenes of Christian Bale's Moses training people to do warfare, guerrilla warfare. And then he outlines his strategy as their general. He says, "All right, so no, we're not going to go attack the monarchy directly. What we're gonna do is we're gonna bring the empire to its
supply lines."
Yeah, the supply lines, and exactly, and that'll make the people, that'll bring the people to their knees, and then they'll throw off the royalty, and then you see scenes of after interesting. So, Scott, there are a lot of people saying that there's not really any evidence of Hebrews living in Egypt there in the third kingdom. There's not really any evidence of masses of people wandering through the Sinai Peninsula, or even masses of people arriving in Canaan within a 50-year span. What's your response to that?
Well, I think there is some evidence. It's not, what some people are looking for. Some people want, they'd rather see a video clip of evidence than, textual evidence from the Bible or from other sources. Some people, no matter how much evidence you give them, they still aren't going to believe that a certain event occurred. So even if, for example, we find Noah's Ark, everybody in the world can agree that it's Noah's Ark, but they still don't need to believe the message from God about Noah's Ark. So no matter how much evidence you give them for the Exodus, people still aren't necessarily going to believe. And we need to remember that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So just because we don't have a lot of evidence to substantiate one part of a claim doesn't mean that we have to for that particular claim. So the Bedouins don't leave very much evidence behind that they were there. So I'm not sure, how much you could find even from a current modern Bedouin camp. After they leave, you're not necessarily going to find any. You're not going to find any coins, probably. You're not going to find any jewelry or dishes. Most of the stuff that they use is either transportable, they take it with them, or it's, it doesn't last long, so you wouldn't necessarily find those kind of things. How much you could find even from a current modern Bedouin camp. After they leave, you're not necessarily going to find any. You're not going to find any coins, probably. You're not going to find any jewelry or dishes. Most of the stuff that they use is either transportable, they take it with them, or it's, it doesn't last long, so you wouldn't necessarily find those kind of things.
So,
another. Go ahead.
Yeah, for perspective's sake. So, would you say that the time of Moses and the Exodus was approximately 3,500 years ago, like 3,500, give or take a few?
Yeah.
So, I mean, right there's a
yeah. So it's hard
challenge.
to expect to find the same kind of evidence that we would find, for more modern things, or places where they actually built fortifications or a city. This wasn't a city. This was a temporary encampments that moved around. So you wouldn't find the same kind of things there. You're not going to find city walls like you do at Jericho, for instance. So it's a different kind of evidence that you could expect to find.
Right.
And another thing is, to bring this to a modern point that people can understand better. For instance, Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, the missing airline flight. Well, this just happened on March 8th of this year, and it's been one of the most extensive searches in the history of mankind, both like with all this high-tech stuff, sonars, radar, all these different high-tech ways of finding something, and they're completely unable to find any clue of what happened to the flight. And does that mean that we should believe, oh, well, the flight never happened? Because we don't see any evidence for the flight. There's no plane missing somewhere. We don't have the plane that's missing. So therefore, the evidence of something not being there is not evidence that it never occurred. So I think, that's a good parallel that people can see that, today's modern world, you can't even prove that this flight existed. So how are you going to prove that there were some people camping in the desert, 3,500 years ago?
Now there are some people who say that there are significant amounts of evidence in Egypt and in Canaan that the events that the Bible talked about there surrounding the Exodus actually did happen, but they tend to say, well, the evidence is there, but it's often overlooked by scholars because their chronology is off.
Yeah, well, that's part of the problem is, if your chronology is off, then even if you had evidence from a certain period of time that you're forcing into a chronology, but you think that the Exodus took place at 100 years away from that, well, then that evidence wouldn't apply to the Exodus, even though in reality it might actually apply. So if no one can agree on a chronology, it's difficult to say what evidence would fit where in that chronology. So that is definitely a big part of the problem.
All right, let's switch gears on you here a little bit. The Book of Mormon, it makes certain archaeological claims about North America, maybe even Mesoamerica.
Yeah, so the Mormons, they have all these different stories of different things that have taken place in the Americas. But when you look for archaeological evidence for these different civilizations that are mentioned by the Mormons in their holy scriptures, you don't find any archaeological evidence for it. The only archaeological evidence they point to is other cultures that already existed, like the Mayans or the Aztecs. So they're almost claiming somebody else's civilization just because that one actually existed. But you'll never find any coins that are listed in the Book of Mormon. You won't find any of the swords. Some of the books, some of the different writings that, from Mormonism, they believe that elephants were in the Americas, but there aren't any of those evidences actually there. So they have a serious problem with archaeology because there's virtually nothing that they can point to that substantiates their claims versus the Bible. The Bible has, numerous archaeological evidences that substantiates the Bible, and there's no archaeological finds that have ever contradicted any of the scriptural understanding of the Bible. I think, the cinematography in the movie was very well done. So it was enjoyable to see the images. It made you feel like you were there. It looked like you were in Egypt at the time. They put a lot of attention to details. There were some, smaller things that seemed to be a little more Hollywood. Like one of the things that, in movies that feature swords, almost every time that somebody pulls the sword out, it always has to make this certain sound. And so people have come to expect that. But swords don't actually make that sound when you pull them out of their sheath. But so throughout the movie, that's they're always doing that. And even when Moses is just cleaning the sword, it's still making the metallic, ringing sound. So those kind of things are just, Hollywood inventions. So overall, I think the movie was sort of fun to watch, but you have to remember it's a Hollywood movie. It virtually has nothing to do with the Bible except for the names and characters. There's no need for God and miracles in the movie. Everything in the movie basically happens through natural means. The natural events in the movie just happen without any meaning or explanation. So there's no messages given from God for Pharaoh. You don't see Moses' staff in the movie. You don't see any of the signs that Moses was commanded to give to Pharaoh to show that he was a messenger from God with a message from God. So those kind of things were troubling, and I think they did that just so they would not, either offend the scientists or, he just tried to play it down the middle so both sides could get something out of it and like the movie. Yeah, the quality of the movie was well done with a budget of $140 million. You would expect that. Ridley Scott's an excellent director. I just wish he would have had some more biblical input from biblical scholars to guide him on the path, and I think we would have had a lot better movie.
I'll second that motion. My final thoughts. I really wanted to like this movie, and there were parts that I enjoyed, but there were just a few too many things that ruined it for me. In no certain order, my first disappointment with the movie was just the choice of actors. I've never been a fan of Christian Bale. In fact, the only performance of his that I ever enjoyed was from the 2011 film Flowers of War, where he played an alcoholic mortician pretending to be a Catholic priest at an orphanage in China under the Japanese occupation of Nanking. Now, I really didn't enjoy his portrayal of Moses. Joel Edgerton, his portrayal of Pharaoh was actually a lot better than I expected. But, of course, it's just not as memorable as the Yul Brynner performance in The Ten Commandments. My second disappointment is that the movie is just one big downer. There's just no happiness at all. There's no smiles. There's no joy, no celebrations, no thankfulness, nothing positive. Maybe just a couple positive moments in the movie, but on the whole, one big downer. My third disappointment with the movie was how they just mangled the concept of God. Now, whether you believe in one God or not, the concept of monotheism that permeates the books of the Hebrew Bible is one of the most profound and revolutionary ideas, one of the most history-changing ideas in the history of thought. The God of Abraham was not just a tribal god of the city of Ur or a great mountain spirit in Midian. This was a God who describes himself in a mysterious way as I am, which I take to mean the self-existent one. He wasn't created. No one created him. He's always existed. He's the uncreated creator of all that exists. He's not just an animistic spirit behind misunderstood natural forces of a volcano in Arabia. He rather transcends this created world, like a painter transcends the painting. The God of the real Moses was not an impersonal force, but a being who has purposes and communicates. He even provides evidences to enable people to believe his messengers. In the real story, he methodically proves that the Egyptian gods, including the Pharaoh who pretended to be a god, are utterly powerless before him. But in this Exodus movie, it's not the same God at all. There is an infinite amount of difference between an infinite God and a finite God. Now, Ridley and company wrote the God of Exodus out of their movie and replaced him with a powerful but finite alien-type creature with impressive but finite power and vindictive and childish impulses. I hold to the idea of an infinite, transcendent God, which I presume to be the same God that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses had. So for me, this is a movie-ruining insult. I mean, if you did this type of thing to Muslims and their holy book and their monotheistic concept of God, they would be calling for your execution. For the fourth movie-ruining disappointment, I have to return to the subject of violence, which earlier I called a pet peeve of mine. Ridley and company got it totally backwards here in the movie. I mean, how many people did the real Moses kill? One. Moses only killed one Egyptian who was very clearly a cruel and abusive Egyptian. He hid the guy's body in the sand. Now, whether he killed him with his bare hands, a rock, a sword, or what, we don't know. That's not in the narrative. But that was the end of his killing spree. Was he trying to start a revolt among the slaves? Maybe, maybe not. I'm thinking probably not. But if so, he was doing a terrible job of it, because as soon as Pharaoh issued a warrant for his arrest, Moses fled the country. Now, in the book of Exodus, 40 years passes. So when Moses returns to Egypt with his family, he's an 80-year-old man, and he's got his family with him, unlike the portrayal of the movie. Now, this is hardly the type of person who would be able to impress others as this great general who's going to train up your guerrilla force and start a bloody revolution. Moses didn't show the Hebrew elders how good his aim was with the bow and arrow. He showed them the signs that God told Moses to show them, and which he was then going to proceed to show to Pharaoh. And by signs, I mean miraculous signs, miracles of God, acts that only God can do, that people can't do. These acts of God authenticate the messenger of God and the message of God. It was the miraculous signs which caused those Hebrew elders to know that God was going to be doing something special. No army was raised, no plowshares were forged into swords, no trowels were forged into knives. The Hebrews had no strength. Most of their boys had been killed. They were mostly women. Moses had no strength. Well, okay, he had some strength, but not as portrayed in the movie. Only Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the God of Moses and the descendants of Israel, had to oppose Pharaoh, who was at the time the mightiest king on earth. In Ridley's rendition, the capricious, finite alien god proved that he was the best vindictive killer around. Moses also proved that he was pretty good at killing too. It almost seemed like a three-way contest to see who could kill the most people. The alien boy god, Moses, or ran second.
You say this is not your fault. So let's just see who's more effective at killing. You or me?
But in the real story, the historical narrative of the book of Exodus, this was not a violent revolution where men took up weapons against their oppressors. Not at all. This was God demonstrating his power to Egypt and all the surrounding nations. This was also God remembering the promises that he made to Abraham, and it was about him keeping his word to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants. Now, should we participate in coups d'etats and revolutions, such as the Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution? Now, if we follow the precedent of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt, here, a case could be made that we shouldn't rebel in violent ways, even when they are murdering our sons and forcing us to build their cities using whips. The real Exodus story is a case study in nonviolence, at least on the human side. To me, it suggests endure suffering, don't kill your enemies, put your hope in the Lord, the God who sometimes does seem to be very distant and transcendent, but who does nonetheless hear our prayers and occasionally reaches down into our world to change everything. The propaganda for armed revolution of the marginalized proletariat, or however you want to say it, against the monarchy did really ruin it for me. At one point in the movie, Moses, with his sword to Pharaoh's throat, is demanding that the Hebrew slaves be given equal rights and be treated just like the rest of the Egyptian citizens. Like, if Pharaoh would just do that, everything will work out fine, is kind of what I got out of the movie. Now, and as much as I do really, truly appreciate equality in the polis, this is not what the real Moses was asking Pharaoh. In reality, he was just saying, hey, here's the ultimatum. Let my people go out into the wilderness to worship our God for a few days, and then we're going to come back. So I might be detecting a little echo in some of the Ridley Scott movies. The revolutionary tendencies in the Exodus movie remind me of one of the main catchphrases in his Robin Hood movie.
Rise and rise again, till lambs become lions.
And this, of course, is the message that Robin Hood's father chose to etch into stone for his son to discover later. In the context of the Robin Hood movie, it seems like the meaning was fairly clear. The good people on Earth have to endure suffering from their tyrannical leaders over and over until it just gets to be too much, and then at that point it's the duty of the good people of the Earth to summon the courage and rise up in power, in armed resistance, and depose the despots of the world. Now, maybe this doesn't happen in every generation, but for those who really put a high price on freedom, this message at least needs to be impressed upon those of every generation. That's the way I took it anyway. Another way to put it might be the somewhat famous quote by Thomas Jefferson that says, "The tree of liberty must often be refreshed by the blood of patriots." Well, while I sympathize with Ridley's disdain for tyranny, and I agree that men would be wise to prevent tyrants from gaining political power, I cannot agree with him that manly men need to prepare for the next bloody revolution. I understand the temptation, and I understand that manly movies show brave men trying to solve their political problems with bloodshed, and I admit that this is, in a way, very manly and very natural to the character and definitely to the history of mankind, especially when we're backed into a corner, outnumbered, and facing slavery and possibly even extinction. But I also think it is even more manly, perhaps, and definitely courageous to try diplomacy, peacemaking, and other non-violent solutions to our problems, even if it means that we have to experience significant hardships, suffering, and maybe even have to learn how to forgive those who fasten chains upon us and whip us. Ridley Scott said in one interview that he is moved in part here by the perceived problem of conflicting religions causing warfare. Now, this makes me wonder if he took up the task of making this Exodus movie to try to throw some water on the coals of religious fervor, maybe? Is that how he's trying to solve the problem of religious strife? By invalidating both the Egyptian polytheistic superstition and the Hebrew monotheism? Maybe invalidating all religion and saying it's all stupid? Or is he trying to repaint our worldviews with his brushes to maybe introduce or reinforce antagonism to the historical basis for the Jewish claims to Palestine? And that claim, of course, is namely that the God of Abraham supposedly promised them that land. The same God who led them there in power and established them there. Their God that fought Egypt and the 7 nations of Canaan to place his holy people in a holy land. A land that, interestingly enough, is right in the navel of the world, where Europe, Asia, and Africa all conjoin. Now, I'm not trying to say that modern Israel can do no wrong. They definitely do. But think about this. We live in a time where the next world war could be started by Israel or one of the many countries who are not too happy about Israel. I'm not trying to say... I'm just trying to say here that we all really do need to get serious about the question of whether or not the God of Israel really did deliver them from Egypt and place them in the land of Canaan or Palestine himself. Or is it just a myth, or did it really happen? Answers to those kind of historical questions may have some direct bearing on the future of the history of all mankind. So to me, that's all the more reason to relook at the evidence. Now, the fifth and final thing that really ruined the movie for me was how Ridley and team just mangled pretty much every piece of history in the whole story. I realize now that my expectations for this Ridley Scott directed rendition of Exodus were set too high. I think the reason for that is because of the respect that he put into another movie, his 2010 Robin Hood movie, starring Russell Crowe. So even in that movie, he did play a little loose and fast with some of the facts of history, but his team did a very significant amount of detective work, historical homework. They consulted advisors who actually knew something about English history, and they tried to find the historical kernel in the Robin Hood story, and with a few exceptions, tried to be fairly true to English. In fact, they were even able to make a documentary for the History Channel entitled The Real Robin Hood. So it seemed like they were trying, in a way, to demythologize the legend a bit, and in the process, the actors didn't end up wearing tights. That alone makes it one of the best and most manly Robin Hood movies ever, in my opinion. I enjoy historical fiction like that and can tolerate a fair amount of artistic license in the storytelling. But he seemed to up the ante for the Robin Hood genre, giving it, I don't know, maybe a modicum of plausibility. So would he also do the same thing for the Exodus story, when modern scholarship seems so generally skeptical and hostile to the idea of it being historical? At the beginning of the Ridley Exodus movie, I thought maybe so, because they set an actual date, 1300 BC. They mentioned real cities like Memphis and Pithom. They set the story in the time of Pharaoh Ramses II, who's a real pharaoh in a real Egypt in the Third Kingdom period. They even bring in the Hittite Empire and its clash with the Egyptian Empire. So, in some ways, it seems like he was giving the historical narrative of Exodus the respect it deserved. I mean, at least he was treating it at first as if it were real history, which is more than a lot of Egyptologists and historians today will do. So, at first, I appreciated the respect that he seemed to be showing to the story, despite the fact that I really, really doubt that Ramses II was actually the pharaoh in the time of the Exodus. They started off by trying to make it seem like this was real history rather than pure fantasy. But from that point on, it was all downhill from there. By the end of the movie, I was disappointed that Ridley and company may have actually put more respect for the real history of Robin Hood in the Robin Hood movie, which is mostly legend and of little consequence, than they did for the Exodus story, which is presented as history and is of great consequence. Obviously, this movie dredged up some questions about the historical reliability of the Exodus narrative for me. This raises some good questions. Is there any evidence for the book of Exodus outside the book of Exodus? Is there any evidence at all that the Hebrew people settled in the Egyptian land of Goshen, that they prospered there and then were later made into slaves? Is there any evidence that the Egyptians killed young Hebrew boys to prevent this people from growing larger and becoming an internal threat to Egypt? Is there any evidence of the 10 plagues, of the destruction of the Egyptian army and 600 chariots? Is there any evidence of a mass exodus of well over 600,000 Hebrews, perhaps 2.5 million Hebrews, migrating from Egypt into either the Sinai Peninsula or maybe the Arabian Peninsula, and wandering for 40 years as nomads there? Is there any evidence for these Hebrews, who had been bricklayers and shepherds, and obliterate several fortified, walled city-states in Canaan, starting with Jericho? The fact of the matter is that most experts today will probably say there's not really any serious evidence for any of that. A book by Dr. Joseph Holden and Dr. Norman Geisler, titled The Popular Handbook of Archaeology in the Bible. Started to change my mind on that. Actually got me excited that maybe the prevailing scholarly consensus needs to be rethought, and that there actually may be a lot of evidence for these events that most of us have no clue about. So there's a movie coming out January 19th, 2015, in a few theaters. It's called Patterns of Evidence. It's made by a filmmaker who just needed to find out for himself if the Exodus really happened or not. He traveled, he interviewed several scholars, he questioned some assumptions, and he filmed it all. He gives a great introduction to some of the debate revolving around those questions, and he also provides some very tantalizing, and for me, pretty compelling evidences. So for those of you who want to investigate the history of the Exodus further, I'd encourage you to check that movie out soon. You can start with the website http://patternsofevidence.com. It's clear to me that the Eurydian Exodus was pseudo-historical fiction that wasn't even really based on the book. This was not artistic license, but more like graffiti that spray-painted onto what was otherwise art. It's not a version of history, it's a perversion. And quite frankly, the original Exodus account seems like the true history, and Ridley's Exodus is a work of modern mythology. I was hoping that it wouldn't be quite as audacious a departure from the original story as Darren Aronofsky's Noah movie was, but having seen both, I have to say they're both in the same boat. It seems like Hollywood may be intent on replacing the stories of the Bible with myths. Now, earlier Josh brought up Gnosticism, and the more I think about it, the more I think that that might be a good way to think about the process of modern myth-making. So this film about Exodus is not a biblical Jewish or biblical Christian movie. I think it's probably better to think of it as a neo-Gnostic, fact perverted into myth genre. All right, well, thanks for taking the time to consider this review. Please feel free to leave any comments or questions. And if you like manly discussions about manly movies, don't forget to subscribe.